On a cold morning in late October, in a small town on the shores of Lake Huron, a 51-year-old woman sat at her kitchen table and counted $78 in loose bills, twice, because her hands needed the motion more than her mind needed the number confirmed. Outside, the wind off the lake rattled the storm windows her husband had never quite finished caulking, and the kitchen smelled of instant coffee, and the particular staleness of a house where someone has died 3 days before. Marguerite Boileau had been married to that man for 24 years, and in every one of those years she had misjudged him completely. His name was Théo Boileau. He ran the old Marina at the edge of town, the one on Sunset Bay Road that the county had stopped bothering to plow properly a decade back. For most of their marriage, Marguerite had treated his work the way you'd treat a stubborn cough that never quite goes away. He was up before light every morning, down at the docks checking lines, hauling boats in and out for people who mostly couldn't pay him what the work was worth, and some who paid him nothing at all. There was a proper marina now, a big glass and cedar operation 14 kilometers up the shore, with a heated boathouse and a bar that served flights of Ontario wine to people from Toronto. By any sane measure, Theo's little marina should have closed the year that place opened. It didn't close because the people who still came to him, the retired steelworkers, the single mothers who kept a battered aluminum boat as their only way to get their kids fishing, the old Franco-Ontarian families who'd been coming since his father ran the place. They didn't have money for flights of wine. They had the lake, and they had Théo. He charged what people could pay, which was often nothing. When it was a kid wanting to learn how to dock a boat, he took nothing and threw in an hour of his time besides. When it was a widow trying to sell her late husband's old runabout, he'd fix the engine himself before he even mentioned a price, and then he'd forget to mention the price. Marguerite had stood at that same kitchen window 1,000 times, watching him wave off money like it embarrassed him, and she'd felt something curdle in her chest each time. She wasn't cruel. She'd grown up with nothing, in a rented flat above a laundromat in Sudbury, and she understood money the way some people understand scripture, as the only thing standing between a family and disaster. She kept books for 3 different small businesses in town. She could look at a ledger and tell you, within $1, how close to the edge somebody was living. And she watched her husband hand out kindness like it cost nothing, while their own roof needed shingles and their car needed brakes, and neither of them ever seemed to have quite enough. They'd married in June, in the little Catholic church her mother had insisted on, 27 years old and thinking she understood the man beside her. Théo was quiet in the way that some men are quiet because they're empty, and she had believed, wrongly, that he was quiet because he was careful. The kind of man who saved, who planned, who built something solid underneath his silence. She learned only slowly that he wasn't saving money. He was saving his words, and spending everything else on the lake and the people who needed it. They had no children, and that particular grief sat quietly between them for years, unspoken, the kind of thing that hardens a marriage's silences into something harder to break. Marguerite sometimes wondered, in the dark, whether a child would have made him serious, would have made him choose them over every stranger who wandered down to that dock with an empty wallet and a boat that needed fixing. She never asked. She only kept the resentment folded up small and put it away, the way she put away every bill she couldn't quite cover. There had been a season early on when she still tried to change him. She'd lay out the month's accounts on the table, her small neat columns, and point to where the propane money had gone, where the roof fund sat empty again. He would look at the numbers with real attention. He respected her, and he respected numbers. And then he'd say that the Doran boy had needed his outboard rebuilt, so he could get his father's boat working again before hunting season, because that man had lost his job at the mill and this was the only meat they'd have. And what number was she supposed to write down for that? She never had an answer. Not having an answer made her angrier than any fight could have, because it meant she couldn't even win cleanly. She could only lose slowly, year after year, to a decency she couldn't argue with and couldn't afford. They found Théo on a Tuesday morning, slumped in the bait shed with his hand still on a coil of rope, his heart simply finished with him at 59. The doctor said it had likely been fast. Marguerite nodded at that information and felt no comfort in it whatsoever. The funeral was small and the wind off the lake cut through everyone's coats. Marguerite stood at the front in a black coat she'd bought second-hand years before and never had occasion to wear, and when she turned to look behind her, there were more people than she'd expected. far more than a rundown Marina had any right to summon. They stood in clusters at the back, not one of them stepping forward to speak to her directly. She assumed they were shy, unsure what to say to a widow. A few left strange things by the grave. Not flowers, a handful of loonies and toonies set carefully in a row on the fresh dirt. One man left a small carved wooden oar. She picked up one of the coins, turned it over, set it back down, and didn't understand for weeks that each one marked a debt somebody had never been allowed to repay. 3 days after the funeral, Marguerite sat counting $78 and opened the envelope from the town lawyer. Théo had left her everything: the house, the shoreline lot, the marina and its buildings. She read it and almost laughed, dry and aching, because he'd left her the very thing that had swallowed their whole life. But underneath the will was another document, notarized, with language that didn't match anything she thought she knew about her husband. A conservation and public access covenant, registered with the county, dated 19 years back. She didn't understand most of the legal wording, but one line she read over and over. According to this paper, Théo's marina wasn't only a marina. It had been formally dedicated, nearly 2 decades earlier, as a protected public lake access and rescue point, bound under provincial law in a way she couldn't yet grasp. She didn't sleep that night. She thought of every free hour he'd given away and understood, for the first time, that she'd spent 24 years resenting a weakness that might not have been a weakness at all. If she'd been wrong about that, what else had she been wrong about? Grieving a man you understood was hard enough. Grieving one you'd never understood at all felt like losing him twice. The next morning she put on her boots and walked down the marina herself for the first time in years, really looking at it instead of resenting it from a kitchen window. It was worse than she remembered. The main dock leaned hard to one side, boards rotted through in places. The old workboat sat overturned on the gravel, its paint peeling, one side dented. Behind the boathouse, half swallowed by cattails, stood a small shed she'd never once noticed, latched shut with a rusted iron hook. To anyone who knew how to judge property, the whole place looked like a pile of waterlogged lumber waiting for the ice to finish it off. Standing in that ruin, cold and wet, she noticed something odd anyway. The workboat, dented as it was, had been turned over with real care, the hull wiped clean, not a single crack. The coiled ropes in the boathouse were wound tight the way only someone who truly knew boats would wind them. This wasn't neglect. This was a place tended to the very last day by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. A county assessor came a few days later, walked the property for 10 minutes, and handed her a number. $0. He mentioned, almost kindly, that she could let the county take it back and clear the tax debt if she liked. Marguerite thanked him, folded the paper, thought of the $78 in her account, and the small shed with the iron hook, and decided to stay long enough to clean it out before she let anyone take anything. She started the next morning with a bucket, a utility knife, and hands more used to keeping ledgers than hauling rope. The cabin had become unbearable in his absence. Every chair a chair he wasn't in. But down at the water, among his ropes and tools, his absence felt different. Not a hole. A thing set down that might be picked back up. She scraped algae off the hull, sorted coiled lines gone stiff as wire, and found, scratched into the steel near the stern where no customer would ever see it, a row of small tally marks. She stood a long time before she stopped trying to count them, because she understood, without knowing why yet, that whatever they counted mattered. By noon on the second day, she heard gravel crunch behind her and turned to find a young woman standing at the tree line, watching. Maybe 23, thin dark hair pulled back, wearing a work coat with a clumsy patch at the elbow, a patch sewn by a hand trying to imitate a skilled one. She didn't answer when Marguerite called out a greeting. Instead, she raised one hand, palm flat, moved it in a slow wave like the surface of water, then closed her fist and lifted it. It would take Marguerite weeks to understand that gesture as pulled up out of the water. The girl couldn't hear or speak. People in town called her Sparrow. Nobody quite remembered her given name, since she'd washed up in this county as a small child after a bad storm years back. And it was Théo who'd started calling her that, the smallest bird with the loudest call. Marguerite learned it in pieces, from the woman at the grocery, from the man who serviced outboards on the highway. From scraps people let slip once they realized who she was and how little she actually knew. Sparrow lived in a room above the hardware store, worked odd jobs, and every night, no matter the weather, walked down to light the old lantern on the post at the head of the dock. Then she'd sit a while looking at the water and go home. That was what Théo had done every night, for more than 35 years. When he no longer could, Sparrow took it over without being asked. Marguerite had seen that lamp her whole married life and thought it a waste of oil. Now she watched Sparrow climb up and light it at dusk, and slowly understood it wasn't for the dock. It was for the lake, so that anyone out there in the dark, not knowing which way was shore, would have a point of light to swim toward. Théo used to mutter something every time he lit it. People told her, "Keep the lamp burning, nobody swims home alone." Marguerite had lived 24 years beside those words, and never once heard them. Sparrow began coming down each morning without being asked, knowing which board was rotten, which knot held, how to flip the workboat without wrenching your back. The two women worked side by side in a silence that slowly built its own language. When Marguerite needed a tool, Sparrow had already put it in her hand. They ate lunch on the mended dock, and Sparrow showed her things about the lake she'd never noticed in decades of living beside it. Where the current pulled hardest, where a hand drawn flat across the throat meant never swim there. One afternoon, Marguerite noticed that clumsy elbow patch again and pointed at it. Sparrow mimed sewing, then pointed toward town, then touched her own chest. Someone had taught her to sew, badly, kindly. That night Marguerite brought her own sewing kit down to the dock and began teaching Sparrow properly. How to hide a knot, how to keep a seam straight. For the first time since the funeral, something warm moved through her chest. She was passing something on. She didn't yet know it was exactly what Théo had done his whole life, only to the lake instead of a needle. It was Sparrow, on the 5th day, who led her to the small shed with the iron hook. She laid a hand on the door, then looked at Marguerite with an expression both urgent and pleading. "It's time you should see this." The hook had rusted stiff. It took 3 strikes with a hammer before it gave. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and machine oil and old paper. Along the back wall, floor to ceiling, sat a shelf packed with what looked at first like account books. They weren't account books. The first one Marguerite pulled down had a cloth spine, pages soft and curling at the edges. On the first page, in Théo's careful square hand, was a heading, "The Bay." Those who made it. Below it, ruled into columns, were names. A date, a note, a life. April 1988. The Aubin boy, 9 years old, went through thin ice off the point. Pulled him out below the culvert. Further down, July 1991. A man, name unknown, came down off the point in a squall. Unconscious, lived. She sank into the chair. She turned the page. A whole decade of names. Some lines were only a sentence long enough to chill her. Some had a single word she came to dread, lost. She counted that word 6 times across 35 years, and understood he had written down even the ones he couldn't save, as if remembering them was the last thing left he could do for them. She read for hours without noticing the light shift across the floor. She read entries from before she'd even met him, the handwriting rounder, younger. She found tucked between the ledgers, letters, dozens of them. Some typed, some scrawled on the backs of postcards. "Thank you, Mr. Boileau. My daughter has children of her own now. She's alive because of you." One line, in a child's careful print, kept flatter than all the rest. "You were the only one who ever waited for me. No name, no date." Marguerite held it a long time, wondering what had become of that child, understanding only that Théo had kept it for reasons he'd never once explained to her. Sparrow came forward, leafed through one ledger with the ease of someone who'd done it many times, and found a particular page. She laid her finger on a line. Marguerite wiped her eyes and read, "May 2005, the big flood. Family from the point camp, the parents didn't make it. A girl, maybe 4, found at the shallows below the boathouse. Can't speak, can't hear, nobody came to claim her. Called her Sparrow." Marguerite looked up. Sparrow was watching her, hand resting on the page that recorded the day she'd been pulled from the water that took her parents. And for the first time she smiled, small, trembling. Then she made the gesture again, palm flat, moving like water, closing and lifting. "This is me. I'm one of the names. He didn't waste his life. He gave it away, one rescue at a time." Word spread through town within the week, the way it does in a place small enough that everyone still goes to the same grocery store. And then people began to come. A man in his 50s who'd been the boy pulled off the ice in 1988. 3 kids of his own now, the oldest named Théo. A woman whose son had been born on the wrong side of a flooded causeway, delivered safely because Théo had rowed her across in the dark, and then quietly returned her only dollar to her mailbox, wrapped in a scrap of paper. A retired miner Théo had ferried to dialysis 3 times a week for 2 years and never once billed. A fisherman who'd lost his boat to the bank and his wife to illness, and had stopped, in his own words, seeing any reason to keep going. until small unexplained kindnesses started arriving at his door, a length of good rope, a jar of preserves neither Boileau had ever made, a note that only said the current's running different this year. Come look at it with me before you set your lines. A question about the lake was something the man couldn't refuse, and somewhere in the going he'd decided to stay. One by one they came, and Marguerite began to understand that the rescues hadn't all been from the water. Some had been from despair, from drink, from the slow drowning that happens on dry land. Théo had pulled people out of all of it, and written it down in the same square hand, because to him there was no difference. A person going under was a person going under. You went out. You didn't ask why. It might have ended there gently. A widow learning her husband's true worth, a town finally saying thanks out loud, but kindness rarely gets to rest. He arrived on a gray morning in November in a black SUV so clean the gravel seemed almost afraid to touch it. His name was Grant Whitfield, mid-40s, an expensive coat, shoes that had never known lake mud. He was development director for a company called North Shore Ventures, and he came bearing condolences delivered in the practiced warmth of a man who knows warmth is a tool. Then he got to the point. His company was planning a new marina and condo development along the bay, and the ideal site for the main access channel, after extensive survey, was Théo's old marina. He named a figure, $60,000 cash, for a piece of land the county had just appraised at zero. Marguerite thought of the $78 in her account. $60,000 could fix the roof, could mean an old age with something behind it. Whitfield saw the number working behind her eyes and smiled, because he'd done this before and thought he'd won. He wasn't cruel, she would think later. He simply believed his own arithmetic the way some people believe in scripture, and he'd been rewarded for that belief so consistently that the wrongness of it had hardened into something that looked, from the outside, like success. Then he made his mistake. Looking around at the leaning dock, at Sparrow, standing quietly by the boathouse, at the lamp on its post, he said, in the gentle voice of a man stating the obvious, that this backward little marina should really have folded years ago, that the new development would be so much better for everyone. Something in Marguerite went very still. Not anger exactly, clarity, because she had said that very thing herself in her own heart 1,000 times over 24 years. Hearing it now in his mouth in that smooth, certain voice, she finally heard how it sounded, and she didn't like it. She didn't answer. Whitfield added, almost gently, that his company did have the right of expropriation for public benefit if she chose not to sell. The words dressed politely, but both of them understood exactly what they were. That night she sat with the number honestly, the way she once sat with the household accounts. $60,000 would buy a warm house and nights without lying awake counting change. But when she laid it all out, the columns wouldn't balance the way Whitfield wanted, because his number, large as it was, had no line for Sparrow, no line for the next child who'd fall through the ice. A development with a gate and a fee doesn't save the people with no money to pay it. Théo's lamp had saved everyone. She thought of the ledger's last entry, a boy carried home in the rain the day before Théo died. No fee recorded because the boy had none, and she understood that selling this land meant selling that line too, and every line not yet written. If you've been sitting with a story like this one, if this kind of quiet, stubborn kindness means something to you, this is exactly the moment to hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. It genuinely helps a story like Marguerite's find the person who needs to hear it. The next day, she drove to the office of the old lawyer who'd handled the will, a man named Basile Cormier, 70-some years old, his office thick with the smell of old paper above the pharmacy. She laid the notarized covenant on his desk and asked what it meant. He put his glasses on, read it, and a slow smile spread across his face. He'd drawn it up himself 19 years back. Théo had sat in that very chair and told him he wanted to do something no one could ever undo after he was gone. A different company had come sniffing around the shoreline the year before with glossy plans for condos and a marina. And Théo had understood something most people without money don't understand until it's too late. That land worthless today can become land men hunger for tomorrow. And when that day comes, it's always the person with the least power who gets pushed off it. Cormier had asked him why he didn't simply leave it to his wife and trust her to hold it. Théo had answered that Marguerite was the strongest person he'd ever known, but that he had no right to put that weight on her alone, standing between the land and a company with lawyers and patience. He wanted the law to carry that weight instead, so the place would still be protected, even after there was no one left strong enough to protect it themselves. Under the covenant, the land had been permanently placed under conservation easement, dedicated to public lake access and water rescue, forever. No commercial structure could be built there. It couldn't be expropriated and converted to private development. The power of expropriation, Cormier explained, doesn't override land that has already been legally dedicated to a higher public purpose. Théo had shut that door 19 years before anyone came looking for the key. Grant Whitfield returned after the new year with a thick file and 2 lawyers whose shoes were entirely wrong for the gravel. He spread condemnation papers across the Boathouse table and began explaining the process in a voice that assumed she'd simply fold. Marguerite didn't argue. She laid a single sheet on top of his stack, the notarized covenant. One of the lawyers read it again, and leaned over to whisper in Whitfield's ear, and she watched the confidence drain out of his face. He tried a few more angles anyway, mentioned amending the easement, a generous contribution to the land trust. Old Cormier, who'd come along that day, only took off his glasses to clean them, and said the easement wasn't a locked door with a hidden key. It was a door built directly into the wall, with no key at all, because the man who built it had met men exactly like Whitfield before and knew they'd always come back. Before he left, Whitfield paused and asked her, almost sincerely, why a woman with $78 to her name would turn down $60,000 to keep a pile of rotting wood. Marguerite looked at him a long moment and told him her husband had spent 35 years making sure nobody had to cross that water alone, and she wouldn't be the one to sell what he'd paid for with his whole life. You appraised it at 0, she said. My husband appraised it at everything he had. One of you got it wrong. He didn't answer. He drove away and never came back. The development went up 11 kilometers down the shore instead, where no one poor needed a lamp lit for them. Spring came late that year, the way it does on the Huron shore, hesitant and gray and then suddenly green. Marguerite and Sparrow rebuilt the dock board by board before the ice went out, repainted the workboat, mended the boathouse roof. Marguerite used her seamstress hands to stitch the old life rings back together and taught Sparrow to do the same, so that when she herself was gone, someone would still know how to keep them afloat. People from town came down to help without being asked, leaving lumber and paint and casseroles on the dock post without a word. The place an assessor had priced at 0 was being rebuilt in a currency his spreadsheet had no column for. She didn't sell it and she didn't hand it to the county. She kept it. Every morning she walked down that gravel path in the rhythm Théo's boots had worn into it, and she and Sparrow took turns carrying people across, teaching kids to swim in the safe cove, hauling boats for whoever needed it, and taking whatever they could pay, which was often nothing. She stopped writing down who hadn't paid, the same way Théo always had. One evening in May, she carried the ledgers out to the shed table under the storm lantern. The newest one still had blank pages, Théo's last entry stopping the day before he died. She sat a long time before the empty page, more used to stitches than to words, thinking about everything she'd misunderstood for 24 years. She wouldn't apologize to him even in her head. He'd never have wanted that. It would only have become a debt. She would only say she understood now, that she'd read every name, that she'd keep the lamp. Then she picked up the pen and did the only thing that felt true. She didn't write a eulogy, she kept the record going. Marguerite Boileau. Keeper of the landing following Théo Boileau. Keep the lamp burning. She set the pen down. Through the boathouse door she watched Sparrow climb the post, and the lamp flared to life, a small yellow ring thrown out over black water, enough that anyone out there in the dark, not knowing which way was shore, would have something to swim toward. In the years after, the people of that little town on the bay grew used to the sight of 2 women at the old Marina. One who couldn't speak, and one who had finally learned how to listen. Young people who'd been pulled from that water, as children brought their own children down to learn how to row and how to read the current, and Marguerite sat them at the shed table and made them read every ledger, name by name, until they understood the place was never really timber and rope. It was 35 years of people who hadn't drowned, and a promise somebody had to keep carrying. Marguerite Boileau lived many more years beside that lake. She was never rich. The account never grew past what it needed to be. But she came to understand by the end something the man in the clean black SUV would never understand as long as he lived. A legacy isn't what you own. A shoreline lot can be appraised at 0. A dock can rot, a bank account can run down to loose change on a kitchen table, But there are things no assessor can measure, no expropriation can seize, no number can buy. A name written down so it's never forgotten, a hand reaching into the dark, a lamp lit every single night for a stranger you'll never meet. Théo Boileau left his wife a lake and a shelf of ledgers full of other people's names. It took his death for her to finally read them. But once she did, she never stopped, and in the end, that's all kindness ever really asks of any of us. To keep the door open, to leave room on the page for the next name, and to keep the lamp burning.